I'm Roniel,
I'm DaRon.
and today I would definitely love to talk about African history. And DaRon, I know you know a lot about history, so this would be interesting coming from the perspective of somebody who's not African or African American. However, this has nothing to do with African Americans, more about Africans. But I recently had actually looked over at or was reviewing a video called "The Greatest Lie Ever Told About Africans," and I kind of wanted to do a reaction for everybody today to give more of the history of Africans, whether you're African American or not. It may be interesting, and just get some thoughts on whether we believe these things to be true or not. So let's kind of do a reaction look at this, and then maybe we can converse about whether this is true or false.
In a previous video, I talked about what I considered the top 10 lies told about Africa, the biggest being the disingenuous idea that black people sold black people into slavery. I frequently speak about this oversimplification as we cannot apply 21st century Pan-African concepts to 17th or 18th century peoples. The overwhelming majority of African people back then identified in full with their own culture and linguistic group, and not skin color or even phenotype.
That's
So what's
true
been
today.
implied by that statement is ahistorical at best. But this lie about African people is only a subgroup of an even bigger lie, one of the first lies ever told about our ancestors.
I know he hasn't started with it yet,
Yeah.
but I just want to remind everyone that what he just said, yes, they're different ethnic groups and they don't get along today, just like they didn't get along back then. When the Danes went to South Africa, for example, the Zulu at the time were just pushing out of uh, their original territorial homeland and into South Africa and killing and enslaving each other, which I mean, you had slavery here in the Americas. That's what the Aztecs did, the Mayas, the Incas. When you look back at it, Sacagawea, she was sold into slavery. I don't know of a
Yeah.
culture that hasn't had slavery.
So then I just wonder why he thinks that where he's getting it from that it never happened.
There's this weird thought that you had roving bands of Europeans running around enslaving everyone all across Africa and across the Americas, and there weren't enough Europeans to do that. And firearms back then were not that advanced relative to most of the other weaponry being used. The proof, of course, being in the Indian Wars. The turning point for the Indian Wars, of course, was the use of the Gatling gun. And had it not been for the Gatling gun, Native Americans had firearms roughly the same as the US Army. And a lot of Africans had firearms that they bought from Europeans, but they still made extensive use of lances. In fact, at least for Native Americans, and actually in Africa as well, just like it used to be in Europe, to when you count coup, you actually had to get close enough that you hit them with a short range weapon, be it a club or a lance or something of that nature. Africa had something similar. Not It had to be a melee weapon, not some kind of ranged weapon, and that's what showed you were really brave and that you had that occurring with some regularity. Just went, or I should say, just goes to the point that the firearms back then, the real differentiator between and what made firearms so popular to begin with in Europe was the amount of training that it takes to use a firearm is significantly less than the amount of training that it takes to, for an equivalent range, work archery, learn how to use a bow of a heavy enough weight, and get it on target often enough that it matters. So I don't know. It's well documented. I mean, there were even African kings who threatened to go to war with Britain when Britain told them to stop the slave trade and stop enslaving people.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of document like on that. So that's why I kind of don't understand how this is a lie if there's, you know, documentation about this and in history. So I don't understand. And it's just weird, you know. And like how else if this is if Africa, as they say, was one of the most used like more, had the most resources. I'm not saying it doesn't. There's not other places, but had a lot of resources useful, which mean a lot of power, right? So somebody can just come in and just do whatever they want, right? This big continent, that somebody can just come in and do whatever they want without having negotiation, and somebody wanting to finding something useful or some way to make money or to get something back or a trade. Uh, it just kind of doesn't seem right. There's like some things that doesn't seem like it makes sense there. Like there's like a disconnect there. It doesn't make sense when I hear these things. And there's a lot of other videos or YouTube videos out there saying the same thing, similar things. So it's just weird. Doesn't make sense.
There's an odd revisionist movement going on right now, and this is something that we talked about actually many episodes ago with the accepting who we are kind of deal. It's like I've seen posts claiming stuff about white people need to atone for the war crimes of their ancestors, right?
Yeah.
But what happened back then was very normal. So on my mother's side, who is completely European, she has a great uncle who was abducted by the Seneca, actually. They abducted him and then raised them as their own. That was very common. You would have a raid, you'd kill the adults, usually, steal the kids, depending on their ages. And depending on which group, some would torture and murder the kids and dismember them. In fact, actually, I have a book sometime we'll have to discuss some stories from where they talk about its survivors of captivity. But these are concepts, war crimes, what we consider war crimes today were things that were practiced all over the world. Africa, North and South America, Australia, all over Asia, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't care who you are here because you have ancestors who committed war crimes. Probably against other people, and they're probably incredibly vicious. Should my father's side sit there and apologize for stealing European children? I don't think so. Should my mother's side, which is very Viking, apologize for what the Vikings did? I mean, the Vikings were brutal, and a lot of what they did was war crimes. They literally targeted churches, monasteries, things of that nature that were not well defended, and rape, pillage, etc. Should the Zulus apologize for what they did? The reason why so many people in so many of the tribes in South Africa banded together and joined the Dutch to fight the Zulu is because how vicious the Zulu were. Should the Aztecs apologize to my father's ancestors? They were mortal enemies. This is all so stupid, but I don't need to revise history and pretend like these things didn't happen. Pretend like my mother's people weren't Vikings and they were just traders, harmless little traders. No, they weren't, and that's okay. I mean, they did what they did, and I had nothing to do with it. You had nothing to do with what your ancestors did.
No, it's like people want to erase history, but you can't.
Yes, and it also turns Africans into victims.
Yep.
Africans are so helpless, so poor. They're all just such victims of these evil, brutish, clearly overlord Europeans. It's a weird message. It's a weird message.
It's not like, like Africans. There's a lot of kings and, queens over there. Like to say that they're so poor, and no, that's not. I mean, look at what they're doing over there to their own people.
Right.
I'm
Right.
not saying all of Africa. I'm just saying that if you look at majority of it, it seems like they're doing just horrible things over there. So, they're doing it to their own people versus, other Europeans or other people doing it to the African people. So I mean, if you're doing it and you're giving them away or selling them, then who's at fault here?
Slavery is still alive and well in parts of Africa, unfortunately. And I'm
Yep.
not just talking about sex slavery, which is, but I mean actual slavery. And it's still practiced there in some parts, in actually significant parts. And it's a sad thing. So this is all very strange. And I've mentioned to you a very interesting BBC interview. I say interview, it was an entire piece years ago that I heard where they were talking to people from Liberia and they were talking to people from 3 different groups. For those of you who don't know, Liberia is where a lot of former slaves, U.S. slaves, went. They were shipped back to. So there was this big back to Africa movement that seems to crop up every so often. I don't know why. Because, like we discussed, you're not African. And
Nope.
if you go to Africa, you're invading there, as ugly
Yeah,
as it sounds. You don't know the culture, you don't know the languages. You
yeah,
don't.
we don't speak the same.
Right, right. And it's. Anyway, so they went through and they carved out Liberia as a country, but so this discussion was with 3 different groups, and they were all talking to one another. And one of the groups were descendants of those former slaves who'd come back from the United States and been shipped over to Liberia. And one of the gentlemen asked, he said, well, why did you guys do this to my ancestors? And both of the spokesmen of the 2 other groups, these were groups that had not been enslaved, had not shipped off, and instead had been selling slaves. So I guess that in and of itself defeats what he just called was the greatest lie. But they explained that his ancestors had been so cruel and were running around exterminating all of these other tribes. So these tribes banded together, and what they did was they started conquering his ancestors' tribe, and it was common to take captives, and they didn't want them in Africa anymore because of what they had done to their respective families. And so they sold them to slave traders. And
Yeah,
and we know there were African kings who threatened to revolt if Britain ended slavery. We also know that there were African kings who outright, in written letters, told the British king that all of the British colonies were doing it wrong. And he wanted Britain to give him rights to have plantations and to have slaves because he felt that the British were, these are his words, not mine, were too kind to the slaves. And if it were up to him, because of an endless source of slaves through all the people around him, he would run the most brutal plantations that were also the most efficient. So, I mean, there are good and bad people everywhere, and I'm sure what he was saying and doing he felt was right for his people. You
yeah.
can't view it through modern lenses, though. Obviously, I think everyone would look at that and say that's not great.
No, I agree. Let's continue and see what else he talks about.
What up, African World? It's Home Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and supporting this content. If you'd like access to full courses and sources, or you simply want to show your support, you may do so by clicking the Patreon link in the description box below. Before we get into the greatest lie ever told about Africans, let's not forget some of the more well-known ones. The Dark Continent trope really became one of the most popular lies told about African people. The idea was that Africans were backward savages with no civilization, with the exception of Egypt, which they consistently place outside the sphere of African cultural achievement. Civilizations like ancient Ghana in West Africa weren't privy to much observation, despite it being known for its vast wealth and powerful military, which Muslim writers wrote about. Archaeological reports highlight ancient stone settlements that are believed to be a precursor to Sudanic civilization in the region, not to mention the art of the Yoruba people, who single-handedly forced the world to acknowledge African ingenuity and intelligence, as some try to assign the development of such works to ancient European travelers. There's just too much to ignore when it comes to African civilization. The Dark Continent trope doesn't have any ground to stand on when we consider ancient Meroitic civilization and the great Kushite rulers who started what some scholars call the African Renaissance, which was perhaps the first Renaissance in human history. And let's not forget the largest stone structures south of the Sahara. Great Zimbabwe is just one of many stone structures in the southern African region, revealing the glorious era of Shona civilization. Another lie that consistently makes its rounds in our Western consciousness is that Africans had no writing systems and that they relied on oral communication. Africans used diverse methods to communicate, oral transmission simply being one of them. One of the more popular writing forms in West Africa is called Nsibidi, believed to have originated amongst the Ikoi people of Nigeria. This writing form is largely viewed as ideographic or pictographic, conveying messages through symbols. It's interesting that many writing forms in Africa were originally invented for a specific class of people and not intended for public dissemination. For example, Egyptian hieroglyphs were originally only known amongst the priesthood. This is also true for the secret writing form of the Songhai people, who use ideograms to communicate amongst a secret society or religious group. Interestingly enough, this writing form was only revealed to the public in 2010 by a Songhai scholar named Hassimi Maiga. When dealing with African scripts, we can point to the Meroitic script of the Kushites, which to this day has not been fully deciphered. And that's really disappointing, as it would have been incredible to decipher Queen Amanirenas' stela concerning her triumphant interaction with the Romans, in which her primary objectives were met in a treaty. Even Southern Africa has some hidden gems when it comes to writing forms. João de Barros, a distinguished Portuguese analyst of the mid-16th century, upon his visit to Zimbabwe, wrote a very important description concerning the discovery of a writing form in one of the vassal kingdoms of the Mwene-Mutapa Empire, called Batua. De Barros writes, "Over the gate of the building is an inscription, which neither the Moorish traders who were there, nor others learned in inscriptions could read, nor does anyone know in what character it is written." We really don't know what João de Barros saw, but from his perspective, it seems clear that he viewed what he saw as a sort of writing form which was indigenous to the region. Not even the Swahili traders that accompanied him could decipher it. Unfortunately, we really never hear about this again. Anyway, all this...
So what are your thoughts on that?
I find this guy's interesting because he mixes a lot of things together and makes big assumptions. The Kingdom of Kush wasn't a unified, homogenous group, and they were not particularly successful against the Romans or the Egyptians. In fact, the Romans and Egyptians ruled them for a very substantial period of time. They're not... So he's right in that there are pyramids. They're small, but there are pyramids in different parts of mostly southern Africa, and they're interesting, and they're being explored more and more now. But I have to ask the question, do you think it's the job of Western archaeologists to uncover the ancient history of everyone else?
No.
It's,
I mean,
I'm sorry, please.
go ahead.
No,
No, I don't think it's their job, but I mean, isn't that what they are in their quest to do?
It is, but I think there seems to be, in some of what I'm hearing, there's this emphasis that it's the job of Westerners. Well, Westerners are only now finding out about this script and that script, and oh, they're only now finding out about this written language and that written language. It's not. I mean, Africa is a very capable continent. They have incredibly well educated people. They have a lot of people, hundreds of millions of people. I think Africa can explore Africa because it almost comes off as, so when the platypus was first described to Western biologists or Western scientists, I don't believe they had split the different sciences up yet at that time. When the platypus was first described to Western scientists, the scientists didn't believe them. I mean, you hear the description of a mammal that lays eggs and has a duck bill. Oh, and by the way, it also has it's venomous. It's weird, and I don't know that I would believe it if you described it without me seeing it at the time period as well. It's not in what science is supposed to do.
Yeah.
I think, though, so we don't study much about the history, for example, of China. So he wants to go on about African successes, African accomplishments, but why is he ignoring China, Japan, Thailand, Taiwan? I mean, there are a lot of different places. Also, my understanding of the Dark Continent thing was it had more to do with the jungles of Congo and the mystery behind it because it wasn't well explored. I never took it to be because they were, savages. The term savages was mostly used against Native Americans anyway, but
Mm.
it's no different than how the Romans called everyone barbarian. Barbarian was more of a the light of Rome is so bright, everyone else is in darkness relative to it. That's why the Dark Ages, by the way, are called the Dark Ages. They weren't a terrible time. I mean, if we want to talk about correcting history, in general, the Dark Ages were not that bad. They were called the Dark Ages because relative to the brilliance of the Roman Empire before its collapse, before its demise, the succeeding periods were just dark. It's like they rolled back into, to use the term, the Stone Age. Some people are too sensitive, but I don't think it's the job of Western archaeologists to run around the world finding the world's history. I think we as a people, with regard to Native Americans, for example, when you talk Latin America, it's Latin American archaeologists who are running around making these discoveries about Latin American artifacts and the brilliance of kingdoms gone. And Latin America had many such kingdoms. I say similarly, it's Africa's job to do that. I don't. It almost reeks of colonialism to assume that the Western world should go make these discoveries and the Western world should be the one telling the history of Africa. It's not our job to tell Africa's history. And Africa does not focus on Western history. So,
Yeah, like, do they go around saying, "Hey, here's what we found about Westerners. Like, here's their history."
right, that's abnormal. When I lived in Japan, the Japanese didn't run around talking about the history of Europe and of the Americas. They focused on Japanese history. This is what happens. This is part of the problem when you are a diaspora and or when you are an immigrant population. That's how things go. It's just how things go. I mean, that'd be
Yeah.
like someone who's of Vietnamese descent coming to the United States and complaining that we don't teach Vietnamese history and don't teach about the incredibly advanced empires that had existed in Vietnam a long time ago. It's just weird.
Well, if that's something you wanted them to do, then that's something you'd have to do yourself.
Exactly. That's exactly right, and that's my point. And the other thing is that the kingdom of Kush was always very minor. At best, it was really, really, really small, even at its peak. I think the largest it was something like 1 million people, which is small, particularly when you compare it to similar kingdoms at the time. And they didn't do well militarily, and they were a hodgepodge, like most other kingdoms back then. And what it was they would travel up and down the Nile, if I remember correctly, and that's why you would see them do raids into Egypt. That's why you would see the Egyptians do raids into them. And both kingdoms happen to have important things. As I recall, the big thing that Kush gave to the Egyptians was the stone that they needed for the pyramids and things of that nature. And that made Kush somewhat well to do for a little while. But they also were not as, they didn't look like they do today.
Interesting. Well, it's just kind of crazy. Like I said, like it's crazy to go on here and try to figure out, especially if you're an African or you're African American, come from an African descent. But it's like interesting to come on here and wonder if it's actually real or not. Like you don't know if the stuff is real unless you actually, studied your history or African history and really know. So it's kind of crazy because people will actually come and debate about history of Africa, but really don't understand or have any proof that these things didn't happen or did happen.
Yes, yes. And the sad part is when you have proof, they sit there and claim that there was a giant conspiracy. For example, when we discussed it, we know what Cleopatra looked like because
Yeah.
Cleopatra went through and she did a big tour all across Rome with Julius Caesar. And so a lot of people made busts of her, there are paintings of her, there are even coins that she made of her and coins that other people made of her. So we know what she looked like. But you have a lot of people sit there now and they try to revise history and say, "Oh no, she was black." Well, just because you're from Africa doesn't mean you're black. Like what he was talking about when he mentioned Egypt. Egypt was very
Yeah.
different ethnically and culturally than it is today. It was very different ethnically and culturally than sub-Saharan Africa, just like Morocco. And we know this, there have been a lot of genetic studies on mummies and dead that they have found all across North Africa, and there wasn't the admixture that you see today. You did not get people from the sub-Saharan region all over North Africa. That didn't come until much later. That actually came with the Muslim raiders, where the Muslims were going through and enslaving people. Actually, did you know a lot of the slaves came from Muslim countries?
Yeah.
And most of those were Europeans that they were taking.
Yeah. It goes like there's some history where I remember hearing about, Muslims and Arabic people coming over and enslaving and bringing slaves from there. So that's what I remember hearing and reading. But again, that it's very interesting, especially as you're talking about. I guess you have to think about the different time periods as well.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, People will try to say, "Oh, well, the greatest Africans were the greatest in Egypt when they were in the Egypt, time period, or when we talk about Egypt and Egyptian and all of the science base and things that came out of it." But again, it just goes back to the time period and who actually ruled.
Right, right. Because let's be honest here, first and foremost, the standard class isn't the one that invents the blue collar class. Your main workforce usually doesn't do most of the inventions. It does happen,
Yeah.
but typically they don't. It's typically people with more money and time, especially back then. That's why you had the gentleman scientist, because they were the only ones with the time, because they were filthy stinking rich to run around and discover things.
Yeah, and this is some people got to understand. So either way, we will continue with part two of the greatest lie ever told about Africans. This is our time. I'm Roniel.
I'm DaRon.
And if do you guys believe that these are lies? Are they true? Are they false? Are they real? Let us. We would love to hear your comments below. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more episodes like this one. Until the next time.
Have fun.